Well, Hans, there's been a lot of news the last couple days, well, really the last 2 weeks, but it's sort of culminated in the last 2 days about the FBI in terms of what the FBI knew, what Director Wray was actually telling Congress. Frankly, it sounds like he probably perjured himself twice. But there's another element to the FBI, and we'll get into that, but there's another element to the FBI that's sort of overlooked. First of all, the problems with the FBI go much further back than just this recent saga. And there was another event that really highlighted that, and that was the fact that Peter Strzok, the guy that initiated the Crossfire Hurricane investigation in Trump, the original surveillance, he received a $1.2 million settlement from the DOJ, and his partner in crime and lover, not lover, whatever she was, Lisa Page, I think she got $800,000. And, when you and I both looked at that, we immediately sort of felt like, hey, this is a payoff. So we thought maybe we'd start talking about that a little bit before we get into the more recent details and news surrounding the current events with the FBI.
Yeah, I think the whole Peter Strzok thing has not been, properly covered or understood in a sort of holistic way, because what we get with this guy, what we have gotten for the past, 7-8 years, is lots of little scandals. Some of them pretty big, but they're all like piecemeal. Oh, there's this and there's that text message and there's that and whatever. So I think it's important to tell his story and how that all fits in with this wider FBI corruption problem. Because it's a perfect sort of example of that. And the fact that if you'd told me like 8-9 years ago that the top brass of the FBI are all corrupt, I was saying no and whatever. And then we started to get, and it's not just that it's just Strzok. There were many people there, but he is sort of the poster child of all these problems. And of course, now he gets paid off, which is just completely unheard of. And by the way, he got paid off just for one small part of his lawsuit. The other things are still ongoing. So before Biden's out, he's probably going to get a whole lot more money as well. So this is just the privacy part. So I think what it comes down to, the part that he got paid off for, is that his text messages were released by Rod Rosenstein back in late 2017. And of course, that's what everyone remembers about this guy, that he had this alleged affair with his co-worker, Lisa Page. By the way, she wasn't just a co-worker. She was the deputy director's counsel. She sat on the top floor there. She was involved in all these things. We'll get into some of the really bad stuff she did here in a moment. But let's focus on Strzok first. So the text messages came out, and everyone was kind of focused on, the two lovers, and they sent each other thousands and thousands and thousands of messages. I mean, it was just an incredible kind of array of just a huge catalog of messages. And there were plays being done on this. Remember the plays that people did, like the Strzok text messages play, and then they reenacted them and haha and so on. And it was kind of fun for a while, but my problem with it all is it was kind of a distraction, because the text messages made it look like here's this kind of guy who is just out of control and he's got this lover and he's not serious and whatever. But in the meanwhile, two things got missed. The one thing is a lot of text messages are missing. They're just missing. We've never seen them. We can look at the times to see which ones are missing. And then the other thing is some of the really important ones were only released much, much later through the General Flynn case and not through Rod Rosenstein. So the fact that Rod Rosenstein released them, this is what Strzok got paid off for, means nothing in the bigger scheme, and maybe even worse, it was a distraction all along from people like us and the general public digging down into what these guys really were up to.
Yeah, and I guess before I go into that, 2 points that are probably worth making is, first of all, Strzok was sending all of these messages, including his insurance policy message, which that was the biggie that got all the attention at the time. Maybe we should be doing this as an insurance policy in case Trump wins. And that was done in a government device. It wasn't a private phone. And Strzok was also fired for cause. When Bowditch went through there, I forget what his position was at the time, but when he issued the formal letter on Strzok's dismissal, I mean, it was damning. It was something to the effect of, I've never seen such egregious behavior in my entire career. So Strzok was clearly fired for cause. The point of those two items is that his lawsuit, at least in my mind, was going nowhere. In other words, this wasn't a pending lawsuit that was about to bring all kinds of negative publicity on the DOJ. Rather, it was a nuisance lawsuit that was filed that could have been dismissed. And rather than treating it as such, the DOJ used it as an avenue to make a payment to Strzok. And I think they wanted, maybe there was a little bit of payment for past performance, but I also think there was a payment for silence, and that's what they really wanted out of him. Is we're going to go ahead and give you some money, and we don't want it's a informal NDA. That's kind of how I viewed it.
Exactly, and the silence can be explained through various things. Some are kind of known, and others are not known. So let's go through them. So Strzok obviously is the one who initiated the whole Crossfire Hurricane witch hunt against Trump. We know that we have the opening document that was written by him, approved by him, sent by him to himself. It's just Strzok. I remember you and I talked about this years ago when that first came out, and we were like, what on earth is going on here? So anyway, the point is there's a backstory there. How did it really start, right? Because you got this highly suspicious document where this guy is just doing everything. He's approving everything by himself, for himself, to himself. So who gave the instructions? What exactly was going on in the background there? So that's always been a big question. There's more questions like that to do with, for instance, and here's where we get into some stuff which is a bit into the weeds, but I think it's important to understand as to what this guy might be hiding. One of the text messages, which was not released by Rosenstein and only came out much later in the, I think I mentioned General Flynn. Some came out in a General Flynn case, but there was one that actually came out much later in the Sussman case in like 2022 or something.
Sussman is where we found some really interesting stuff.
Right. And so the FBI or Rosenstein never released that stuff. So to blame them now, oh, they released all the bad stuff. No, they actually tried to kind of cover up the bad stuff. It took a lot longer for the bad stuff to come out. And even then, it didn't come out directly. It came out through sort of, you had to dig inside files of files to get there. And in some of the stuff that was in the court case against Sussman, Durham, who brought the case, he didn't talk about it. He didn't mention it. He didn't make a point about it. He didn't mention it in his report or anything. This had to be really dug out from very, very deep down. So one of them, for instance, is the fact that, and this was totally covered up by everyone, that Danchenko, the Steele dossier so-called source who disavowed the whole thing, he was hired by the FBI much earlier than known, before the FBI even talked to him. That was in the Strzok text messages from way back when. So again, I don't want to get too much into the weeds here, but just to give a quick overview, Danchenko is the primary subsource for the whole dossier, all the stuff about P-tape and this and that and whatever. So the FBI was trying to figure out, who is this guy? Is he credible? Then they found him, and they found out that Steele had lied about everything. The guy was totally not credible. He wasn't in Russia. He was in D.C. All the stuff, that we've talked about many times. So what does the FBI do? Normally, they should have just thrown everything out like, oh, well, that was a hoax, the whole thing. Let's throw it away. What they did instead is they took Danchenko and hid him. They concealed his existence to anyone, including Congress and everyone, by making him a confidential human source. And it was assumed, well, we found out through Durham that had happened, but it was assumed that happened much later after, things had unfolded. No, it happened right after they identified Danchenko, before they ever talked to him. So it was a plot from it was treason from the first moment.
And if I remember correctly, we're talking about February of 2017.
Well, they hit him as early, they had the Strzok text messages from January 12th. They only spoke to him on January 24th.
Yeah, and to put again, so people remember, that time frame is actually a couple weeks before Trump actually was inaugurated. So, in terms of how things were done. And again, as you said, they didn't turn him out. They didn't get, dismiss him as well, they didn't dismiss the entirety of the dossier. Rather, to protect the validity of the dossier, they paid him, made him a confidential human source, and it was impossible for any information to be disclosed. The significance of a CHS is the fact that he's not going to be subject, there's not going to be FOIA requests on him. He can't talk to the media, all of that. The guy's locked up in a safe little box and nobody can say anything. And they did that after they found out he lied. That not only was the primary subsource for Steele without a lot of validity, he was just making shit up.
That's right. And the fact that they hit him is the proof of treason. This is
yes.
You can't have it any other. There's no other explanation that works here, because again, the honest thing to do at that point is to say, well, the whole thing is a hoax. The guy just admitted everything's, this is just gossip from his friends. It's just made up stuff. He never expected it to be in any dossier. Oopsie. But then they hit him instead. So what other explanation can there be than treason? Because you want to go after Trump, so you need to keep this whole thing alive. That's what it was all about. But coming back to sort of our initial point here, all the Strzok, and this is not widely known or known at all, all the Strzok text messages from that period when that happened, hiding Danchenko, how the whole Danchenko thing unfolded, in particular, January 2017, February 2017, all those messages are missing. So, everyone's been kind of focused on all these. Yeah, the insurance policy is a pretty bad one. But to be honest, I think the treasonous stuff, the insurance policy, they've explained it in various ways and they can come up with all kinds of, interpretations or whatever. I don't believe that. I think it's pretty bad. But I think the Danchenko one is much worse. But anyway, that was hidden. And we don't know. These are the known unknowns. We know that there are more text messages, but we have no idea what they say. We just got these little pieces out of Flynn and out of the Sussman cases. We don't know what else there is. So and this is the unfairness of it. When it's said that, he got paid off because Rod Rosenstein dumped all his text messages, that is not true. First of all, as you said, he didn't get paid off. This is more like, hush money, sort of. Well, I guess paid off, but it's more like hush money. It's nothing to do with the privacy. But second of all, I think far more importantly, Rod Rosenstein did not release all his text messages. They just released the bits and pieces that they thought were, you could give the public without exposing the treason. So there's still a lot missing.
Well, and those text messages came off of a government phone.
Right. So he never had any expectation of privacy to begin with, because if you use a government phone, well, it's the property of the government. So it never made any sense to settle this case. But so if we come back to this, why is he being, what does he know? Not settle
it. They should have dismissed it a long time ago.
Of course, absolutely. Why does he, and in fact, there was a memo written as part of this case in the olden days, before, Garland took over, before Biden took over, which completely annihilated the entire premise of Strzok's case. It's right there. All the arguments are perfect in terms of no expectation of privacy, public has a right to know, on and on. Of course, the public has the right to know that this wasn't just some little FBI guy. He was the head of counterespionage, the director of counterespionage at the FBI. And he is talking about insurance policy. He's talking about, no, we'll stop him. When Lisa Page's lover asked, Trump's not going to be president, is he? No, we'll stop him. This is stuff the public ought to know. But again, coming back to what is it that he knows that we don't know yet? Why would we need to shut him up? Why would he need to be shut up? And the answer is, for instance, all the text messages that are missing, all the stuff to do with Danchenko, that's not there. And he knows what happened there because he was there, and they don't want us to find out. His lover was involved. I said we come back to this. I think this is another point that's never really discussed, which ought to be much more important. Is Lisa Page wrote that talking points memo, which led to Mueller. In March of 2017, Comey went to the Gang of Eight and he briefed them on this Trump-Russia investigation for the first time. And that then directly led to Mueller. Now, March of 2017 is a couple of months after they found out about Danchenko and the fact that the whole dossier had been made up. And yet what is inside that memo, the one that Lisa Page, Strzok's lover, wrote? It says that Steele is credible, dossier is credible. It says that the source is based in Russia. When they were talking, that they had hired this guy. He was in D.C., so they lied and lied and lied. They even said, oh, we have no control over the source. That's what Comey told the Gang of Eight. Well, they hired him. They were paying him. I mean, that's the ultimate control. So everything was a big fat lie in that March 2017 memo. Well, Lisa Page wrote that. Well, how did that come about? Who told her to write it? Who molded the whole thing? Those are all unknowns because we don't have the text messages and no one's ever asked them, and that's never been investigated. So my point is there's a lot of stuff that we don't know, and why they needed these two to just keep quiet.
Yeah, one of the other reasons I figure as well is that they didn't want to get exposure of the ICA, the Intelligence Community Assessment, that Strzok was a part of. And what you highlighted with Comey, where this FBI creates him as Danchenko, as a confidential human source, which then protects the dossier, the Steele dossier, from being exposed as a fraud. That allows him 2 months later to go out in March and go to the Gang of Eight. Well, remember, Brennan went to the Gang of Eight and briefed them all individually so he could tell them what he wanted, each one what he wanted to tell them, back in August of 2016. So there was kind of a two-pronged attack. Brennan was setting up the groundwork, and then Comey picked it up once Trump actually became president. There's another, when I was looking at, and by the way, I do think the ICA is another area they really do want to protect, because that became sort of the genesis of the entire Trump-Russia collusion nonsense, which then chased Trump for the entirety of his 4 years. But when I was looking at Strzok, when I first started looking into this, I did two things. I created a timeline that I just kept constantly adding to as I found things. And I also created a list of names. And I think it titled it, people affiliated with Russiagate or whatever. And I just kept adding to it with little descriptions so I'd have a database. And Strzok was one of those that was so puzzling because out of nowhere, this guy just kept coming up over and over again. And you're like, how is it possible that this guy can keep popping up in all these different areas? And I always had a little bit of mixed feelings about Strzok. I don't think he was a nothing, as some people have said, but I also don't think he's everything. I feel like he was meant to be, he's a higher echelon FBI employee, but he's the guy that maybe they allowed to get overly exposed with some careful non-exposure. And as you said, those text messages were released in dribs and drabs. I think, wasn't it Ron Johnson who released the big Strzok, Lisa Page text release at one point, if I remember correctly? Right. And if anybody wants to go look, there's a great website that's run by a friend of ours, Nick Wheel. It's called the SpygateProject.org. And you can actually search through all their texts. But like you said, we're missing a huge chunk. And they came out in dribs and drabs, and I think it was very selective in the way that these things were released to kind of, do what they historically do, is put out information that they want you to see that becomes a shiny object, and later on, when you don't care as much, more gets released, and the truly sensitive stuff is still within the FBI. So it's just a repeated pattern of intentional misbehavior. And like you said, you can't overstate the Danchenko thing. That demonstrates that the FBI was willfully targeting Trump and ignoring very real information they knew that disqualified the whole thing. It's unbelievable. It
is. And just to pick up again on this point that you made, which I think is just so incredibly important in terms of what the dribs and drabs of the release, as well as what Rosenstein released and so on and so forth. Not only did the attention then kind of shift to Strzok and Page and the sort of the lovers. I mean, how often, it was kind of fun, I guess. Trump tweeted about the lovers the whole time. If you go back to his tweet archive, so many people we really talked about. There were plays written off of the text messages and so on. But what's the net effect of all that? The net effect is that everything was Strzok and Page, and in particular Strzok. And the net effect is that Strzok, as you said, was he a nobody? Was he a bigwig? Whatever. The net effect is that everyone kind of assumed Strzok is the bad guy. Right. That was at least sort of the public perception. And, well, what that leads to is that we're not focusing on the really big crimes. We're not focusing on the fact that the entire top floor of the FBI is and was totally corrupt. We're not focusing on Comey. We're not focusing on McCabe. We're not focusing on Pientka. We're not focusing on, all these other pre-stab. We could go on and on and on. I mean, I can't stand the guy, but Strzok did take a lot of heat, but that was by design. And now
that was the point I was trying to make, is that they pushed Strzok to the front and center, and he was high enough and involved enough to be taken very seriously, and he deserved to be taken seriously. I'm not saying he wasn't, but it was a method of distraction that, and I became, I don't want to say guilty of it, but I think everybody, initially, just because Strzok is the name that kept coming up, you didn't know anything about him, and you find out that he's involved in every aspect of Russiagate, and you're like, what in the hell is going on? And so the focus goes there, and it took a little while to pull back and go, wait a minute, we've got to be looking at the rest of the entity. Now, McCabe ultimately got fired, but what did he get fired for? He got fired because he lied to the Inspector General and to the FBI's inspection division, and he was basically leaking things to the media. So yeah, he finally got held accountable, but he didn't really get held accountable for the right things. He effectively got fired for cause for leaking to the media, and the rest of the FBI just kind of skated away. And McCabe, for that matter, is getting paid to this day on MSNBC.
Well, and so is Strzok.
Yeah.
I think, this is exactly right. And I think, not to belabor the point, but it's so important to come back to Danchenko, because that's the proof of treason. That's what this is. If you cut to the chase, that's what you end up with. That's where you end up with. That's the most important bit of information in this entire affair. The fact that they hit him immediately, so that Devin Nunes and his inquiry, the Senate, the courts, the FOIAs,
nobody
the FISC
knew
court,
about him.
Right, the Carter Page FISA, the FISC court. No one knew about this guy. No one knew a thing about this guy because, as you say, they locked him away in a box and gave him a bunch of money. And they did that right at the start, immediately, but before anything else happened. Like, okay, we got to hide this guy. That's the treason. That's your proof right there. And that entire part of the story, which is, to me, is by far and away the most important part of the entire FBI side, or the sort of the government side of the Trump-Russia collusion hoax. There's the Clinton side. Okay, we can talk about all that, but on the government side, when the government went after, because Clinton going after Trump is not, you might say treason or whatever, but that's not the government. When the government did it, it becomes treasonous. It is no other word for it.
Yeah, and again, just to reiterate, because it was you and McIntyre and a couple of our other researcher friends which uncovered this and put it all together. Wasn't it Fool who finally named him, or was it Walk of Fire? But regardless, it took a lot of sleuthing that never even really got, by the time it came out, they did achieve one goal, is that it was huge news, but by the same token, a lot of people didn't really care anymore because we'd moved on so far, which is always kind of their goal with this. But not to lose sight, the gravity that you're trying to imply to this is absolutely valid. And it is, I think, in both of our minds, no coincidence at all that we can't find any Strzok texts for that particular period. And I have to imagine that there is a very, very real reason for that, and that if we could unearth those, there's a whole nother layer to this that would be exposed. So, I think wasn't there some pretty negative reaction from some of the official channels when, Danchenko's identity was actually unleashed? I think it went away pretty quickly because they didn't want to draw attention to it, but I know that there was some real concern over that.
Oh, it was huge. You had New York Times. So we unearthed this guy's name basically online in July of 2020. And then within a few days, the New York Times ran its typical, IC stenographer type piece where Trump fans attack whatever, threaten this guy's, everything is now threatened because he was exposed. I think that was something like that. Trump MAGA fans expose FBI source or something like that. Which is a total lie because, first of all, not MAGA fans. Second of all, not FBI source. Maybe nominally in name he was an FBI source, but as we just said, the whole point of hiring him, they hired him before they talked to him. They hired him before they knew anything about him. If you hire someone without ever having spoken to them, without knowing anything about them, for the only because you know that this is Christopher Steele's source and that he cannot know what he purports to know because he was never, he didn't live in Russia, he lived in DC, he had no contacts with anyone in the Kremlin. All the things that were supposedly the case were not the case. So you don't talk to him, you don't know anything about him other than the fact that the whole dossier is made up, and you just hide him. You put him away and you pay him a bunch of, he just paid hundreds of thousands of dollars.
I think it was like $470,000 or something. It was a lot of money.
It was, right. So when that happens, you know that's the story, that's the treason. And then, of course, yeah, you're right. The New York Times made it out as if these Trump fans had, destroyed this FBI source and so on. Yeah, absolute rubbish. But the fact that they did that and they did it so quickly, it goes to exactly your point here that the pushback was, immediate. And yeah, Strzok knows about that. He knows how that came about, how they hired the guy, why they hired the guy, what Comey was saying. There's so much more there. And by paying him off, I think they just hope this all goes away. 8 years ago, no one's going to care anymore. And, I think, unfortunately, they're probably right.
Well, I mean, it's a time-honored trick, as we've said earlier. I mean, they're very good at it. And, it does reach a point where people sort of don't care, which is part of the reason why we're talking about it on this episode, is trying to point some attention to it and resurrect that issue a little bit. The other thing that comes to mind, we talked about how Strzok was sort of pushed forward, like let's make him the face of this. But the entirety of the FBI, the leadership was guilty, but it was more than that. I think there's been, for myself anyway, there's been an evolving view that I'm now firmly been in the camp for years, is that it's not just the leadership of the FBI. It kind of went, Strzok was the face, and then it kind of became, well, it was the leadership of the FBI after that leadership was fired, i.e. Comey was gone, etc., McCabe had been fired. Oh, it was just the seventh floor, and we've got new people in place, and Director Wray's in charge, so it was really just the leadership of the FBI. No. It is just, you see these actions from the FBI over and over again. We'll get into them in just a little bit in terms of Trump, in terms of the assassination attempt, but it's pervasive. That entire agency has been corrupted. My opinion is from top to bottom that agency is polluted. That's not to say there might not be, a good agent here or there. There are the occasional whistleblowers, but as an entity, it's not just the leadership. It's pervasive. It's throughout the entire institution. The view that I've arrived at with the FBI is simply that they're in place not to uncover crimes, not to prosecute people who are doing wrong. The FBI's entire job is to be in place to protect the establishment. And they run cover and do whatever they need to do to protect the political figures above them. And that's their real job.
Right. And to achieve that, because you cannot have everyone on the same side ideologically or whatever if you have like tens of thousands of employees. So how do you achieve that? The fact that no one comes forward and no one tells the truth and so on. You achieve that by absolutely toxic management culture right from the top. So it does start from the top, but I totally agree with you. It feeds down. Let's look at some examples here. Pientka. There's a guy called Joe Pientka. We've never found out the first thing about him other than the fact that he didn't like what was going on. I assume kind of in just privately, he's probably a decent guy. I don't know this, but I just assume that based on what we do know. He was there for the ambush interview he was Strzok's sidekick, basically. He did a lot of things together with Strzok. He went to London with the whole Papadopoulos Downer thing. He was there for the ambush interview of General Flynn. He was always there. And then shortly after Flynn was fired, Pientka was like, getting too hot here. I don't like this. He obviously was not happy being part of this giant plot. There's no other word for it. So what does he do? Well, he gets himself transferred out to San Francisco, and then he just does kind of, rank and file stuff. We don't really know because we don't know much about that guy. So my question is, why does a decent person like that, or assume that he's a decent person, not come forward? And, Trump is subjected to this witch hunt for nothing. There's nothing. There was nothing to it for years and years and years. For years and years, all you ever heard on the news was Russia, 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 Trump, Trump, Trump. And this guy doesn't come forward. Another one is Hellman. Remember Hellman he uncovered the part of this Russia collusion hoax right away. He was given these fake Alpha Bank things, like Trump was having a secret communications channel with the Kremlin. And they foolishly gave it to this guy called Hellman, and Hellman immediately, he was like just this IT analyst at the FBI. He immediately saw that this whole thing is a giant hoax, and he said so. We got the text messages in the Sussman case. Well, what did Comey do? Well, Comey said, okay, we can't have it with Hellman because he's too honest. And Comey sent it to some guy in Chicago whom he knew he would sort of play ball. But the point is, why did it take a court case years later for this to come out? Why aren't these people coming forward? And I think that's because of this absolutely toxic management culture where they all know if they don't toe the line, there's going to be problems with HR, there's going to be no promotions, there's going to be this, that, and the other. So everyone just kind of shuts up and just does their thing. And if they've had enough, like Mahncke, they just try and get transferred out. But there's no honesty from within the institution. Zero.
And being a whistleblower is something that's punished, right? You're not rewarded for exposing wrongdoings, rather you're punished. And that gets transmitted through the culture of the FBI very, very quickly. One thing I noticed, you remember when I said something that I started creating a list, and I called it, I just pulled it up, and I called it a listing of participants. And what I noticed that plays to what you're talking about was in 2015, 16, 17, primarily 15, 16, Comey, out of nowhere, suddenly embarked on a huge, lengthy list of people. I have it in front of me, where he started transferring them. And he started whipping higher level FBI officials all over the place. Now, the FBI's always had a culture of moving about, but this was unusual, above and beyond. And what I think he was really doing is he was sort of, as they were embarking on this pursuit of Trump, he'd already probably identified people who might be a problem, who were a little bit more in the Boy Scout camp from his perspective, like probably reasonable guys. And he started just transferring them away. It was a huge number of higher level officials that were suddenly moved about, very conveniently so. So I always, when I found that and was really taken aback, like, what the heck is going on here? All of a sudden, out of nowhere, this huge number of transfers, is that I think he was sort of setting things up so that he wouldn't have people that could be potential whistleblowers involved, and he moved them to other locations so that he could do what he wanted to do. He was cleaning house in advance, effectively.
Exactly. Gaeta as well. Michael Gaeta was the handler for Christopher Steele. He got the dossier on day one in July of 2016. Yet for years and years, this lie persisted in the media that the FBI had no idea about the dossier. It was totally separate. It had no copies, didn't know anything about it. Why didn't he come forward? We could go on and on. There's so many examples of this. And you mentioned whistleblowers. I mean, it's one thing being a whistleblower, going to some kind of media outlet that's actually honest, or one of these groups that you have, for instance, the Biden whistleblowers, the Hunter Biden ones that came forward and actually moved something in terms of what David Wise was doing in that case. I don't mean to talk about that right now, but it's when the FBI is so toxic institutionally that I'm not even talking about that. That's kind of the last step. What should happen in a normal, functioning, healthy organization is that someone like Gaeta or Mahncke or whatever the Hellman, whatever they're called, is able to go to their line manager and just say, hey, we got a problem here. This is not good. We shouldn't do it this way. This is not, blah, blah, blah. And then things get sorted out. Things get taken up from there, escalated, or whatever it is. But it's so toxic that just doesn't happen. I guess just zero, nothing at all. And then eventually, a very, very small number of them do go into, to the public. And then they get, as you say, they get into trouble. They get, like the Hunter Biden ones, they get hounded by the FBI and so on. It's completely broken. I see no possibility other than to just shut it down. I'm not going to say we don't need an FBI. I mean, we need something, right? But it's one of those where you just have to shut it down, tear it all down, and just start over.
Yeah, I don't see how reform of the FBI is possible because the entire culture is so fundamentally polluted. When you reach that point, you have to come in and slash and burn. Simple restructuring is not possible. It's a rebuild process. And here, just before we shift gears, you mentioned Gaeta, and one thing I was thinking is how that was a great example of how things were happening, because Gaeta came in, he got a hold of the Steele dossier at the start of July in 2016, And who does he do? What does he do with it? He passes it along to the New York office, but he also passes it along to Victoria Nuland. And Victoria Nuland takes that, and in her own words, she was responsible for sending that to the leadership of the FBI. Now, what happens there? They compartmentalize that, and people like Strzok, Lisa Page, etc., they don't find out about it according to their testimony until September. And that may actually be true. But that became proof, and I say proof with quotation marks, that the FBI didn't get the Steele dossier until September, when we know that's not true. Leadership of the FBI had the Steele dossier right out of the gate, and then they hid it from their line officers, but they were aware of it as they were allowing the investigations to get set up.
Which, by the way, maybe this could be a good point to kind of move on, but like just to one final little text message here, which we haven't discussed yet, is the fact that Strzok texted Lisa Page in late July, but before Crossfire Hurricane opened, to say that to talk about the ongoing investigations into Trump. Well, yeah, I thought you told me there weren't any because Crossfire Hurricane hadn't opened yet. So
hadn't
that
opened
in
yet.
itself it proves your point that they knew it was right there. So yeah, I mean, all those text messages are not only government devices, obviously no legal case, obviously you're not entitled to any money or whatever, but they were also hugely important for the public to find out what's going on, and we still don't really know half of it because of all the stuff that's still being hidden. But now they've paid him off, so they just hope kind of we can move on. And in terms of what this means in the wider sense, I mean, we already said institutional reform is not possible. And just look at Ray. I mean, just to expand it here, moving on to the sort of more recent topics. So he went before Congress and he claimed that, maybe Trump wasn't shot at all. Maybe it was shrapnel, which he knew to be false. And later on was proven to be false. But he had no compunction to go and lie. And he's the head of the whole thing. So how you ever, he just put out a false narrative. You just wanted to see the false narrative, which is what they do all the time. So I know that's just kind of one little shot here, one kind of shot, a screenshot in time, but what are we doing? This guy's the head of it. And is there anyone who thinks that this thing can be fixed?
Yeah, and Ray perjured himself in my mind twice, maybe even 3 times, depending how you kind of view it. Because the FBI worked to establish a narrative after the assassination attempt on Trump by saying several things. One, they said that the shooter was a Republican, he was a registered Republican. Okay, that may be true. It appears that his family was kind of odd politically, etc. But they ignored the fact that he'd made a, albeit very small, donation to Democrats, but they were aware of his social media accounts while initially telling us there were none. And they pretended that they didn't know what was in those social media accounts, which now, I think it was Andrew Torba who released them out of Gab, who released them. And they tell an entirely different story, and that's one of a Biden supporter. Now, how did Torba know to pull up these Gab accounts of this user? Well, he knows because the FBI came to him and asked him, they told him who it was, asked him to pull up this account, get all the information. This is before Ray was testifying. So Ray knew that there were social media accounts that portrayed an opposite narrative of the one that they were trying to put forth publicly. Ray knew that that Trump had been shot. He cast out of that in his public hearing and said, well, we can't say for sure, it could have been shrapnel, which of course then the media and the left goes nuts with. Meanwhile, the deputy director just testified, and what does he say? There's absolutely no doubt in the FBI's mind, there never has been. Trump was hit by a bullet. Just days after Ray testified himself. And there's one other thing, and I think this actually came out of the broader intelligence community, maybe out of the CIA, and that is that Iran had an assassination plot that was set out for Trump. And that got released right out of the gate as well. So muddying the waters, it could have been Iran. Now that raises its own problem. If you were aware that Iran had an assassination plot that was set out for Trump, then how does that explain the limited resources that they were willing to sign? If anything, that would argue that you should be putting double the resources on Trump's detail. But then it comes out that this whole Iran plot, basically, Iran stated their intentions to target a number of people, one of which was Trump, a long time ago. In other words, it was an ever-present threat. It wasn't anything that was specific. And even in subsequent releases, the intelligence community was forced to admit, well, it didn't have anything to do with this day. It was just kind of an overarching narrative. So on all the different prongs that sort of support the left's narrative of what happened that day, all came from the FBI and the intelligence community, and all of them are false.
Absolutely. And all these people do nowadays is just put out false narratives, seed false narratives, put out false information, and so on. You just can't trust a single word they say. Just a word here about the shooter and this whole. I mean, we have the Gab guy, the guy who runs the Gab site.
Torba, yeah.
He had the subpoena from the FBI asking him for information about this one account, and that account was clearly a MAGA hater. My view on that is that you have, look at Lee Oswald. Lee Oswald was anything. You could find anything in this guy's history. He was like pro this, pro that. I mean, it's just all over the map. These people are nuts. I mean, that's what drives them to do these things. So I think, digging around in this guy's past and trying to do this and that isn't going to really be extremely helpful. At the end of the day, what did they do? What did they want? I mean, if you Lee Oswald's brother actually did some very interesting statements over the years, very consistently. All his brother wanted was to be famous. That's what it was at its core. That's what it comes down to. It's not about what one manifesto that he wrote or this or that or whatever. He just wanted to be famous. He didn't even have an exit plan after he did the shooting. Neither did this guy. This guy was just, how was he going to ever get out of there after he pulled off those shots? It wasn't going to happen, right? So my assumption is he just wanted to be famous. Now, why would he not shoot someone else? Well, that's the ultimate to be famous, because so many people, and this is where we come back to this kind of anti-Trump hatred and so on that's being whipped up by the media, all the fake scandals. Yeah, we can go back to kind of Russiagate. A lot of it started there. They accused Trump of being a Russian puppet, of being a Russian agent. Literally, this is not an exaggeration. Donald Trump is a Russian agent, has been colluding with Vladimir Putin for the past 8 years. That's in the dossier. Okay, so obviously, if you go and shoot the guy,
those were the headlines in the first 3 months of Trump's presidency.
Exactly, and that seeded something which is so entrenched now, where they hate this guy. This is the whole TDS and all of that. I mean, it's grown into this ginormous, horrible thing. But those were the roots of it. What we talked about here in the first part of the show. And obviously, you're going to create this environment where someone, again, wants to be famous. Well, that's the perfect target. And you don't even have to go into what social media post one way or the other or whatever. It doesn't really matter. Trump is like the number one target because of the story, the fake story that was built around him. Because you expect to be a hero. This is the new Hitler. Well, of course, if you could go back to 1938, you're going to kill Hitler, right? You're going to be the big hero. That's what they put in people's minds.
Well, that was the shift that happened, right? So they set the hook. They set the story with the Russiagate, Trump is a puppet of Putin, et cetera, et cetera. And then Trump went away and it kind of fell off and it was just whatever. Trump announces his candidacy and the whole thing heats up again, but they realize that's not enough. And they shift the narrative. Now they've got it where they already have a base ready to believe anything they say. And the narrative that they start going with is, as you said, Trump is Hitler. And Trump must be stopped at any cost because he's going to be a dictator. Never mind that he'd been president for 4 months, that he'd been president for 4 years already and never did any of the things that they're ascribing to, his yet to be term. And they continued to pound that home. That's what they were trying to hide, is their complicity. Because the leadership of the DNC, I'm thinking of like Kaplan, right? Newland's husband. The guy that wrote this 6,000 word essay that Trump is Hitler, and over again, Trump must be stopped at any cost. And what they were doing is they were obviously building up a narrative of hatred, encouraging their followers, you've got to do something to stop Trump because he's going to win. We can't stop it. You've got to stop him. Concurrently, the FBI, the Secret Service, they reduce their protection levels. Something inevitably and finally does happen. And then you've got to make this guy look like a Trump supporter. Why? Or at least a Republican. Why? So that the left doesn't get blamed for fomenting the violence that then inevitably took place. I mean, that to me, that's what this distraction is all about.
Yeah, I agree. And when you bring up Nuland's husband here, that's another problem as to why the FBI cannot be reformed. And by the way, today we're talking about the FBI, but you could say the same about DOJ. We've talked a lot about NIH, Fauci's, NIAID and so on. None of these things can be reformed. You just have to get rid of them.
Yeah.
And in many cases, you don't even have to start over. I'd argue in the FBI's case, you want something, so you should start over. Anyway, you mentioned Kaplan here. What are the chances, right? The guy who writes the seminal "Trump is Hitler" article, his wife is the original recipient in the government of the Steele dossier.
It's, by the way, it's not. I knew that was wrong. It's Robert Kagan.
Kagan, yeah, right.
As soon as I said it, I knew I had his name wrong, but it's Robert Kagan.
What are the chances, right, that you got this guy and the wife and of course Nuland, many other things, Ukraine coup 2014, on and on and on. So this is the incestuousness. This is the fact that this whole place, DC, is run by just a tiny bunch of people, and they're all somehow interconnected through marriage and kids and friends and whatever. And you remember in the Sussman trial, one of the jurors was like a friend of Sussman's wife, everything is always like that, and you cannot fix that. It's an inherent problem, and because they'll always all cover for each other. So what you need to do is you need to outsource these things. So get rid of the FBI, just get rid of it, and then restart it in Oklahoma, and get rid of something else, DOJ, whatever, and restart it somewhere else, Texas or whatever. That's the only way you're going to do this.
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge undertaking, a huge effort, but the fact is the FBI has been doing incredible damage, and again, running interference and protection for the establishment rather than protecting the public. So I agree with you completely. I don't see any way through this that we don't actually get rid of them. But it is important. That's a hallmark of all of these activities is, you scratch one name and you find 10 others that are all interconnected. And it's the same people keep coming up over and over again. And you find that in one way or another, they're all connected to each other. DC is an incestuous little shithole. And that really gets exemplified, when you go through and you create a database of all these names and you start trying to find the connections. And it's not any trouble trying to find the connections. It's you can't stop finding connections. These people are all interlaced with each other. So...
yeah, when makes me think of when Trump fired Comey back in May of 2017, which precipitated or made his problems a lot worse. More than precipitated, just made everything a lot worse. Exactly. And the question, of course, is what should he have done differently? Of course, hindsight is always 20/20 and so on. There's no particular blame attached. I mean, the only blame I'd say is a tiny thing is he fired him while he was out in LA. He should have done, his people should have done his research to figure out where he is right now, because that allowed him this whole thing where he was able to talk to the media and take the FBI plane and blow this whole thing into this massive thing. Anyway, a small thing. The point is, you cut off the head of the snake and it didn't make a difference whatsoever. It just made things worse. I think the realization back then, and hence, this is hindsight, we did not have that understanding back then that the entire edifice is corrupted. Everything is corrupt. It doesn't matter if you get rid of Comey or not. You still got a whole bunch of other. I mean, McCabe was only fired in 2018, and you could just go through the list of all these people. I mean, there was still the whole. Remember?
Early 18. So McCabe takes over for Comey. He's gone 8 months later, and none of it like you said. None of it. You get rid of the top leadership positions. None of it made any difference. The institution continued corrupted as ever it was.
You remember the whole Tebow thing? There was this guy called Tebow who was doing the Hunter Biden investigation. Well, he happened to be in charge of election security and so on back in 2020. And then all of his stuff was exposed. And then like a year or two later, we heard he was still working there. So Anyway, the list is so long that it's just there's simply no point trying to cut off any heads of snakes here or there or whatever. It just doesn't. The institution is broken. It's corrupted. You just have to get rid of it.
If you had any doubts of that, and I didn't, but let's say that you did, I felt like the Twitter files, the initial Twitter file releases, were a great way to pound home that it was endemic, that it was throughout, because that brought to light some of these names that we didn't know. Tebow, there were some others as well.
Elvis Chan.
Yeah, Elvis was a big one. And realizing that there was a whole host of names that we didn't even really know anything about who actually had big roles and were incredibly active in not only, the Russiagate, but in censoring Americans and everything else. And that was pure censorship. It was to cover things up. It wasn't that they were trying to do any good. They didn't want information on Hunter's laptop getting out because it was going to hurt Joe Biden. So every action they've taken, and once you see it down at the mid-level ranks, that it's there and it's widespread at those levels. What was the lawyer, Kleinsmith, who got, he's the only guy that really ever got prosecuted, although nothing ever happened to him. He got a slap on the wrist, got his law license back. Here's I don't want to say low-level lawyer because he wasn't, but, kind of a mid-level FBI lawyer who just instinctively knew that when he got information from the CIA that wasn't helping them go after Trump, he altered the email. He just did it on his own. He didn't consult with anybody. He just intuitively knew that he had to make a change because they wanted to pursue on. And that's what we're talking about this thing being endemic and spread throughout the entirety of the FBI.